A trail crew pushes 2,000 longhorns across 1,500 miles of open country, and every single one of those cattle is worth more money walking than it ever will be dead. That's the detail that breaks people's assumption about this whole story. You'd think a cowboy surrounded by beef just ate beef. He almost never did. Feeding a dozen men for 4 straight months with no icebox, no railroad, and no room to carry fresh meat took a completely different kind of survival skill, and it started long before anybody saddled a horse. Here's the math that shaped everything. A trail boss is driving those longhorns to a railhead in Kansas or a fort in New Mexico specifically to sell them for real money at the end of the drive. Butchering one along the way means eating your own paycheck. So, a fresh steak off the herd only happens when an animal goes lame, breaks a leg crossing a river, or simply can't keep up anymore and would slow the whole outfit down. Everything else the crew eats has to survive months of Texas heat, river crossings, and a wagon bouncing over open prairie with zero refrigeration. And solving that problem is what this whole trail depends on. A typical outfit driving a herd this size runs lean. A trail boss calling the shots, maybe 8 or 10 drovers riding the herd itself, a horse wrangler handling the remuda of spare mounts, and Cookie running the wagon. That's it. Somewhere around a dozen human beings responsible for 2,000 animals worth a small fortune, stretched across open country with no backup and no supply line except whatever they're carrying. Every ounce of food in that wagon has to last because there's no equivalent of a gas station waiting over the next hill. There's just more prairie. By most accounts, roughly 1 in 6 of these drovers is black or Hispanic, men who'd learned cattle work in Texas ranching traditions that predate the Anglo cowboy myth by generations. The vaqueros of northern Mexico were doing this work, including this exact salt and smoke preservation method long before the word cowboy ever entered common use. The skill set survives the trail because it has to. Anyone who can't keep meat edible for 4 months doesn't last a second season out here. Salt does almost all of the heavy lifting. Salt pork is the workhorse of the whole operation. Cuts of pork packed into a wooden barrel and buried in layer after layer of coarse salt until every surface of the meat is starved of the moisture bacteria need to survive. Done right, a barrel of salt pork keeps for months sitting in the heat of a chuck wagon. No ice required. Nothing but salt and time doing the work. The trade-off is brutal on the tongue. Before anyone can eat it, that pork has to soak in water for hours just to pull enough salt back out to make it edible. And even then, it comes out of the pan tasting like the ocean got involved in your breakfast. Beef gets a different treatment because you can't exactly pack a whole barrel of it fresh off a 2,000-pound steer and expect it to travel. Instead, the crew turns it into jerky, long strips of lean meat, cut thin along the grain, salted hard, then hung to dry in the sun over a low fire, or strung right across the top of the wagon cover so the wind does part of the job while the outfit keeps moving. Give it enough time and the moisture is gone. The bacteria have nothing left to work with, and what's left is a strip of meat that can survive a saddlebag for weeks without turning. It isn't tender, it isn't supposed to be. A cowboy gnawing on trail jerky is chewing something built for the shelf, not the palate, and he knows it. Picture yourself as the newest hand on this crew, maybe 18 years old, 3 weeks into your first real drive. Your saddlebag has a chunk of jerky in it that's been riding against your leg since sunup, softened by your own body heat by the time you finally get a chance to eat it at noon. It tastes like salt and leather and whatever smoke it picked up over the fire back at the last camp. You'd trade it for almost anything. But it's also the reason you're not starving out here, 100 miles from the nearest town, with a herd that outnumbers the crew by roughly 200 to 1. By 1866, most outfits are traveling with something that changes the whole equation: a chuck wagon. Texas rancher Charles Goodnight is usually credited with building the first one that year, an old army surplus wagon fitted with a hinged box of drawers and shelves on the back. Everything a trail cook needs to actually run a kitchen, instead of just carrying scraps in a saddlebag. The wagon carries the salt pork barrel, sacks of dried beans, flour for biscuits, and whatever coffee the outfit can afford, and it rolls ahead of the herd each morning so the cook has a hot meal waiting by the time the cattle and the crew catch up. Before this wagon existed, a cowboy ate whatever he could physically carry on his own horse. After it, an entire crew could eat like an actual camp, instead of a scattered group of men chewing jerky in the saddle. The cook, usually just called Cookie, runs that wagon like it's his own kingdom, and by most accounts, he's not an easy man to cross. He's often an older cowhand, sometimes hurt too badly to keep working cattle full-time, which is exactly why the job goes to him. He's up before anyone else, hauling water, building the fire, and getting biscuits into a Dutch oven while the rest of the crew is still asleep in their bedrolls. On a drive that can stretch 4 or 5 months, Cookie is the second most important person on the payroll after the trail boss, because a crew that isn't fed properly is a crew that starts losing cattle, losing horses, and eventually losing men. Beans do more work here than people give them credit for. Dried beans barely weigh anything, survive years of storage without spoiling, and turn into a filling, protein-heavy meal with nothing but water, time, and a slow fire. A pot of beans simmering all afternoon in the chuck wagon's Dutch oven is one of the few warm, comforting things a cowboy gets to look forward to on a hard day, right alongside a strong cup of trail coffee that's been reused so many times it could probably stand up on its own. Smoke does a version of the same job salt does, and a lot of outfits use both together. Hang a strip of beef over a low, steady fire, not so close that it cooks, just close enough that the smoke settles into the meat over hours, and you're doing 2 things at once. The heat pulls out more moisture, and the smoke itself carries compounds that slow bacteria down even further. A cowboy who's grown up around this process can usually tell by smell alone whether a batch has hung long enough, and getting it wrong either way costs the crew food it can't afford to lose out here. Weather decides more of this than anyone likes to admit. A dry, windy stretch of prairie is a gift for anyone trying to jerk beef, because the moisture leaves the meat fast, and there's little chance of it going bad before it's fully cured. A run of humid, rainy days is the opposite. Slow drying, more risk, and a cook eyeing every hanging strip like it might spoil right in front of him. Trail crews learn to read the sky the same way they read cattle, because both can ruin a week in a hurry. Hardtack rides along too, dense little biscuits baked hard enough to survive months in a saddlebag without crumbling or going stale in any meaningful way. It isn't food anyone looks forward to. Soaked in coffee or fried in a little rendered fat from the salt pork, it becomes something closer to a meal. And on a bad week, when the beans have run low and the jerky's running thin, hardtack is what stands between the crew and going hungry. Dried fruit, when an outfit can afford it, gets carried the same way, shrunk down and sealed against moisture so it survives the same brutal months as everything else in that wagon. River crossings are where all of this preservation work can unravel in about 30 seconds. A wagon fording a swollen river doesn't always make it across clean, and if that chuck box takes on water, the salt pork barrel, the flour, the beans, everything the crew is counting on for the next month can be ruined in a single bad crossing. Cooks learn to lash gear down like their lives depend on it, because in a real sense, everyone's next few meals do. A crew that loses its wagon, supplies 100 miles from the nearest town, has one option left. Whatever game they can shoot, and whatever scraps are left in their saddlebags until they reach the next stop. Nobody on that outfit wants to test how long that would actually hold up. Here's the part that never quite makes it into the movie version of this life. When an animal does die on the trail, whether from injury, disease, or just plain bad luck, almost nothing about it goes to waste. Organs, trimmings, whatever fresh scraps the crew can't preserve get thrown straight into a pot with whatever's on hand, and the result gets a name that changes depending on who's listening. In polite company, it's son of a gun stew. Everywhere else, the crew calls it something considerably less polite. It's not glamorous. It's also the closest thing to fresh meat most of these men will taste in weeks, and by every account, they devour it. Here's the detail that actually surprises people once they hear it. For all the danger, all the effort, and all the sheer number of cattle surrounding these men day and night, a working cowhand on a long drive might go the entire trip without eating a single fresh cut of his own herd's beef. The animals under his care are inventory, not dinner. And the food actually keeping him alive is salted pork that's been sitting in a barrel since before the drive even started, and jerky that was cut, salted and dried back before anyone saddled up. The wealth is walking right beside him the whole way. He's living on what was preserved months earlier, because that's the only kind of meat this journey can actually survive. Camp itself has its own rhythm, and it hits every sense at once. Wood smoke drifting low over the grass before sunup, the smell of biscuits browning in a Dutch oven buried in coals. Coffee that's been reheated so many times it's gone bitter and thick, and nobody complains because bitter and hot beats nothing at all. Bedrolls laid out in a rough circle around the wagon, boots pulled off for the first time in 18 hours, and somewhere out past the firelight, the low, constant sound of 2,000 cattle shifting and lowing in the dark. That sound never fully stops. A cowboy learns to sleep through it the same way city people learn to sleep through traffic. Think about what that really means for 4 or 5 months straight. No refrigeration anywhere on the trail, no town within reach most weeks, and a stretch of open country that could swallow an entire outfit if the food ran out or spoiled at the wrong moment. Salt did the preserving, time did the rest. And a Dutch oven full of beans, riding in a wooden box on the back of an old army wagon, kept an entire crew fed across a distance you wouldn't drive today without stopping for gas twice. That's not the romantic cowboy picture Hollywood likes to sell. It's the actual engineering behind it, built out of salt, patience, and a cook nobody dared to make angry. If you want to see what these same crews faced once the cattle actually reached the railhead, that story is exactly where this channel is headed next.